It's really interesting kind of seeing the boomer narrative in regards to older games. Games like Super Mario World and Super Metroid. I talk a lot about how like a lot of people in my generation like put those games on pedestals and say they'll never be topped, and that like games like Metroid Dread are nowhere near as good and aren't worth playing. Obviously, this is all just a giant cope. I've talked about this before. Metroid Dread was phenomenal. I'm sure Metroid Prime 4 is going to be phenomenal. Mario Wonder was phenomenal. But we have seen this really interesting phenomenon where a lot of people act as if games that sell 13, 20 million units are somehow failures. See The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder, right? These are games that outperformed the competition, that were huge major milestones in their series, that were like very popular and well received by their player base, and yet we're supposed to believe that Mario Wonder is not on the same level as Mario 3 because like, oh, it's not as hard, bro. Metroid Dread isn't on the same level as Super because like, oh, it's just not the same, bro. Like, it's all just a massive cope. Like, if you actually spend time with Dread, if you actually play Wonder, you realize very quickly that in a lot of ways these games are actually quite a lot better than their predecessors. There's been a real evolution, there's been a real growth, there's been like a real development. These games have been getting better over time, not worse. But one of the like insane things you see from the community is this complete refusal to admit it. Whether like acting like Zelda games stopped improving after Majora's Mask, or like saying Pokemon stopped being good after Gen 1, it's all just a gigantic cope. It's all just just a stubborn refusal from the community to acknowledge that these games have real value to them, right? That they are getting new fans, that they are expanding, that they are trying new things, that they are still extremely popular. And I do think it's really interesting kind of seeing like the oldest of old fags, try and comment on these situations, like, because I know people who will try and tell you that Super Mario World and Super Metroid were casualized from their NES counterparts. That Mario 3 and the original Metroid were way better than Super Mario World and Super Metroid, right? And they'll like give you all these really vague like assertions, like, oh man, like Metroid 1 was hardcore, like Super Metroid was casualized because it gave you a map, like Mario World is way easier, like, oh, like completely unacknowledging all like the very real advancements that those games have made. Like recently, I read an article from some guy claiming that like, oh no, going back to Zebes in Super Metroid was disappointing because I've already been there. When like it's 16-bit, like you have all these new mechanics at your disposal, the animations are better, like the gameplay itself is better, the environments are more fleshed out, like it feels like a completely different location, like returning to Zebes in Super Metroid was a really good decision on the developer's part because it really built up the series iconography. Zebes is Metroid's iconic location because they reused it in Super the way they did, right? So like this idea that like, oh, like they rehashed this, so that makes it bad. It's just a gigantic cope. And that's my thing with this, like because these people they'll sit there and tell you that like, oh, like Super Metroid and Super Mario World were bad. Well, will you say the same thing about Metroid Prime? Will you say the same thing about Metroid Fusion? Will you say the same thing about Metroid Zero Mission? Will you say the same thing about Metroid Prime 2, Metroid Prime 3, Other M, Dread? If you don't like every single one of those games, you're simply not a Metroid fan. This idea that you're a purist, that you're better than other fans because you grew up on the original NES Metroid is completely and totally wrong because there have been very clear improvements in the series since that original release. Even going from like America to the original Japanese release, I think there were like lots of slight improvements on how the password system worked and stuff like that. Like there were a couple of regional differences, but like my point is like the idea that things were better just because you grew up with them really, really needs to stop with a lot of these people. Like anybody who says that really should be discredited like immediately. And I do think we're moving in that direction because I have seen a lot more pushback against criticisms of Breath of the Wild and Mario Wonder and than I have like in recent years, right? Like compared to like where how it was in the 2000s, it's like night and day, but like there still are a lot of people like openly acting as if like Nintendo has somehow declined and they're not putting out good games anymore. But in reality, they're not putting any effort into finding the good games, or playing the good games. They sneered Emio the Smiling Man. They don't even try Echoes of Wisdom. They don't know anything about Mario and Luigi Brothership, but oh man, IGN gave it a 5 out of 10, so it must be bad. Like, everything they say and do is just a complete cope. They have no experience with modern games. They don't play modern games. They have no understanding as to like what's actually out there. They can't acknowledge when a new game surpasses their favorites. Because I think even there's no denying. Even if you like love the original Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past added a lot when it comes to like the lore and the setting and like the general mechanics and like feeling like an actual lived-in world. You know what I mean? Like you should be able to acknowledge that fact about A Link to the Past, even if you think the original Legend of Zelda is better. And a lot of times you just see a lot of people refuse to do that. I've seen people like pretend claim that Ocarina of Time is a simple remake of A Link to the Past. I've seen people complain about like Majora's Mask for being too different from Ocarina. I've seen people complain about the visuals of Wind Waker. I've seen people complain about how Twilight Princess is too similar to Ocarina of Time. I've seen people complain that Skyward Sword was too different, and I saw people complain about the open world of Breath of the Wild after complaining about how Skyward Sword didn't have the same kind of open world as Skyrim. Like that. This is the reality of the Nintendo fan base. Is that in a lot of ways, the nobody's going to be happy with anything. Like it's just the reality of an entertainment, like of being an entertainment is that like everyone's a critic, everybody's like pointing things out and like making observations and coming up with their own ideas. But like what you have to understand is that doesn't make the product bad. You know, like, you can have fun with like even if games aren't as good as like your all-time favorites or all the or as games that came out before it, like that doesn't devalue them as experiences or like prevents them from existing. I saw a lot of people like do this with Brothership when it came out. Like, oh, why would I play this when Super Mario RPG and The Thousand Year Door are better? First of all, those games are like 25 years old. And second of all, like Brothership is it can be its own thing, Like the fact that other games exist doesn't invalidate it from existing. It is like the reality of it. Like it's its own thing from its own developer that really should have gotten a lot more attention and respect when it was announced, right? And it's getting that now. It's getting that now for sure, for sure. Like I'm finding more and more that like the people who complain about this kind of thing have no real sway over the community, like like they did in the '90s or whatever, 2000s. But like it does need to be talked about more, right? I am so tired of older Nintendo fans trying to tell us that new Nintendo games are automatically bad.